How I Came to Maharishi. 1. Dr. M. Hafiz Sayyid. It was in March 1935 that a friend of mine, Mr. Bertram Catley, gave me a copy of A Search in Secret India by Paul Brunton, which I readily devoured and felt interested in Ramana Maharshi, whom I longed to meet. The same year, during the Christmas week, I paid my first visit to Madras to attend the Theosophical Society convention, from where I went to Mysore in response to the invitation of Sir Mirza Muhammad Ismail. On my return to Bangalore, I accidentally met Maurice Friedman, whose ascetic life made me curious to know who he was and what made him lead an austere life. It was he who told me a great deal about Ramana Maharshi and roused my sleeping interest in him. Through his good offices, I arrived in Tiruvannamalai one morning and was ushered into Maharishi's presence by Paul Brunton himself. After 3 days' stay there, while taking leave of the Maharishi, I begged him to give me his blessing before I left him. He was gracious enough to nod his assent, which meant a great deal to me. Next year, 1936, I visited him again during the Dasara holidays. 1937 was the most momentous year in my life, as I was attacked by a series of misfortunes. I had to stay in one of the rooms in the ashram itself for more than a month due to my serious illness. It was during those days that I realized vividly Maharshi's greatness as a divine master endowed with all spiritual and human qualities. While I was lying ill with high fever, he was considerate enough to visit me 3 times and prepared upma for me with his own hands. My eyesight was affected by high fever. When parting from him and starting for Madras for treatment, I took hold of his toes and touched my eyes with them. That was sufficient guarantee to me in my heart that my eyesight would not fail me. So it has not. I shall never forget his grace, which he gave me during my serious illness. I had no idea what it was till I returned to my place in North India and felt its purifying effect on my life. I had never felt so light and free from all taint of desire as I did in those days. In 1939, again, I went on a sacred pilgrimage to him during the summer vacation. As there was a big crowd in the ashram, I could not take leave of Maharishi before leaving Tiruvannamalai. Its result was that somehow or other I was deprived of the inestimable privilege of having Maharshi's darshan for 3 years. From 1943 onwards, I never missed a year when I did not visit him. I was present during his serious illness and saw him undergoing an operation for sarcoma without any sigh, cry, or anesthetic. The doctors were amazed at his composure and at his amazing peace of mind. During his illness, he was so considerate and thoughtful of the feelings of others that, in spite of his intense suffering, he did not deprive anyone of the privilege of having his darshan. His sense of humanity was as great as his sense of spirituality. On one of the occasions of his birthday celebrations, while reading an article before him, I remarked, "The more a person is spiritual, the more he is human," and he indicated his assent. The sight or even a tale of human suffering touched his heart deeply. I invariably noticed during my close contact with him that he was indifferent to his body, as he believed that it was transitory. The real man in him and in others was beyond any change. One of his plain teachings or advice which he gave to seekers of truth was self-surrender to God or Guru, because he himself had surrendered to the divine and reaped its fruit. This method of approach to truth, he said, was the easiest and the safest if one had an earnest desire to attain liberation. I feel that his method of approach to truth was so definite, clear, and direct that it must appeal to the modern mind because it is essentially scientific. Maharishi never expected anyone to pin his faith in this, that scripture or practice any sadhana or repeat any mantra. All he expected of us was to closely and critically analyze the content of our own being. His words spoke straight to the heart because he lived what he taught. His grace was always there for those who were ready for it. The dominant feature of his philosophy was the unity of life, the oneness of divine essence, which is the indwelling self of all. In view of this deep-seated conviction of his, we noticed that he made no distinction in everyday life between great and small, rich or poor, holy or profane. He treated all alike. He saw one life vibrant in all. Another remarkable feature of his life was that he showered grace on everyone whom he considered eligible for it, whether they were frequent visitors to the ashram and attached to him or not, and to those who came from other ashrams and were the disciples of other gurus. I heard him repeatedly say that there is one who governs the world, and it is his task to look after the world. He who has given life to the world knows how to look after it also. It is he who bears the burden of the world, not we. He also added that each was helped according to his nature, in proportion to his understanding and devotion. Devotion meant turning the mind inwards to the self. We reproduce below extracts from talks with Sri Ramana Maharshi, where Dr. Syed's questions and Sri Bhagwan's answers to them have been given. Dr. Syed: I am covered by Maya. How to be free from it? Maharshi: who is covered by Maya? Who wants to be free? Dr. Syed: Master, being asked who, I know that it is the ignorant me, composed of the senses, mind, and body. I tried this inquiry, who, after reading Paul Brunton's book. 3 or 4 times I felt elated, and the elation lasted some time and faded away. How to be established in the I? Please give me the clue and help me. Maharshi: that which appears anew must also disappear in due course. Dr. Syed: please tell me the method of reaching the eternal truth. Maharshi: you are that. Can you ever remain apart from the self? To be yourself requires no effort, since you are always that. Dr. Syed: when I am here, my mind is sattvic. As soon as I turn my back on this place, my mind hankers after so many objects. I must have your help. Everyone here is waiting for your grace. You yourself must have sought originally the help of a guru or of God. Extend that grace to others now and save me. Before I came here, I desired to see you very much, but somehow I could not find an opportunity to do so. In Bangalore, I made up my mind to return to my place. I met Mr. Friedman and others who sent me here. You have dragged me here. My case is like Paul Brunton's in Bombay, when he was dragged here having cancelled his passage home. I hesitated at first on arrival. I wondered if I would be permitted to approach you and converse with you. My doubts were soon set at rest. I find that all are equal here. You have established an equality among all. I dined with you and others. If I should tell this to my people in UP, they would not believe it. The Brahmins would not drink water with me, nor chew pan with me. But here you have taken me and others like me in your fold. Though Gandhi is striving hard, he cannot bring about such a state of affairs in the country. I am very happy in your presence. I regard you as God. I consider Sri Krishna as God because he has said, "Whomsoever one may worship, the worshipper worships me only, and I save him." Whereas all others have said, "Salvation is through me," meaning himself only. Krishna alone is broad-minded and has spoken like God. You observe the same kind of equality. A skeptic friend of Dr. Saeed, a Muslim professor, had confronted him with the question, "What miracle does your Maharishi work?" He had replied that the ordinary people, being no better than animals, are made men, and that we, being only his children, are endowed with strength by Maharishi. He desired to know if he was right in replying to him. Refreshing peace within is the highest miracle. Maharishi possesses it. "What is that to us?" the other man asked. He replied, "The same peace is bestowed on all visitors to be shared by them. Mr. Paul Brunton has mentioned it in his book. Everyone feels it every day in Maharishi's presence." The whole conversation was mentioned to Sri Bhagwan. Dr. Saeed asked, "I have been reading the 5 hymns. I find that the hymns are addressed to Arunachala by you. You are an Advaitan. How do you then address God as a separate being?" Maharshi, "The devotee, God, and the hymns are all the self." Dr. Said, "But you are addressing God. You are specifying this Arunachala hill as God." Maharshi, "You can identify the self with the body. Should not the devotee identify the self with Arunachala?" Dr. Said, "If Arunachala be the self, why should it be specially picked out among so many other hills? God is everywhere. Why do you specify him as Arunachala?" Maharshi, "What has attracted you from Allahabad to this place? What has attracted all these people around?" Dr. Said, "Sri Bhagavan." Maharshi, "How was I attracted here?" "By Arunachala. The power cannot be denied. Again, Arunachala is within and not without. The self is Arunachala." How I came to Maharshi. 2. Dilip Kumar Roy. Dilip Kumar Roy was a famous musician, poet, and composer. He was for many years an inmate of Sri Aurobindo ashram at Pondicherry. It happened in 1945. I was still living as an inmate of Sri Aurobindo ashram, even though I had come to feel a growing sense of isolation and had begun to surmise that I was a misfit there. My sadness and sense of dereliction only deepened with time, till what little peace I had left me completely, and I felt all but stranded. I need not go into the why and wherefore of it all. I shall plunge straight into what keeps me company as one of the most unforgettable experiences I have ever had. After having been for weeks in the grip of a deep gloom, I wrote straight to Sri Aurobindo. He wrote back at once, giving me the needed permission, which I deeply appreciated. I took the train to Tiruvannamalai, where Ramana Maharshi lived. But as the train rolled on, I felt a deep and growing malaise. How could I win the needed peace at the feet of one who was not my Guru, when I could not attain it at the feet of my revered Guru, Sri Aurobindo, whose wisdom and greatness my heart had never once questioned? Well, I alighted at the station in a mixed frame of mind. But it was too late then, for I was already at the gates of Ramanashramam. How could I return now, after having crossed the Rubicon? Besides, I was driven by an irresistible urge to meet in the flesh the great yogi, who, unlike my own preceptor, Sri Aurobindo, was available to all at all hours. And, above all, I wanted to test the Maharishi for myself and see whether he, with his magic compassion, could lift me out of the deep slough I had landed in. But he did do so, and against my worst prognostications and that. So I could not explain it away as a figment of autosuggestion. But the Lord's ways are not ours, and I won an experience I could never even have dreamed of. So listen with bated breath. I still thrill to the apocalyptic experience that charmed away the obstinate gloom that had settled on my chest like an incubus. Words seem utterly pale and banal the moment you want to describe an authentic spiritual experience which is vivid and intense. Still, I must try. I entered a trifle diffidently a big bare hall where the Maharishi reclined morning and evening among his devotees and the visitors who happened to call. Accessible to all, the great saint sat on a divan looking straight ahead at nothing at all. I was told he lived thus all the time in Sahaj Samadhi, that is, a constant superconscious state. I was fascinated by what I saw, but I will not even attempt to portray with words how overwhelmed I was with what met my eyes. What did I see? Just a thin, half-naked man, sitting silently, gazing with glazed eyes at the window. Yet, something in him spoke to me directly, an indefinable beauty of poise and a plentitude that cannot be described. I wrote afterwards a poem on him that may give a better idea, but I must not get ahead of my story. I touched his feet, and then, without a word, sat down near him on the floor and meditated, my heart heaving with a strange exaltation which deepened by and by into an ineffable peace. My gloom and misgivings, doubts and questionings melted away like mist before the rising sun. I felt I was being cradled on the crest of a flawless peace in a vast ocean of felicity and light. I have to use superlatives here as I am trying to describe my experience of ineffable bliss and peace which lasted for hours and hours. I well remember how deep it was. I felt deeply grateful towards the Maharishi on that restful night as I reclined, bathed in peace, in an easy chair under the stars at which I gazed and gazed in an ecstasy of tears. And I recalled the pregnant saying of his, "Just be. All is in you. Only a veil stands between. You have only to rend the veil, and then, well, just be." I had found this favorite remark of his rather cryptic until then, but now I understand for the first time and wrote a poem in homage to the Maharishi. How I Came to Maharshi. 3. Dr. T. N. Krishnaswamy. I was studying medicine and my final examination was a few months ahead. Together with a few friends, I set out on an excursion to Vellore. I carried my camera with me and took pictures of the old fort and some stone carvings of archaeological interest at Vellore. There was not much to see there, and someone suggested that the temple at Tiruvannamalai was a huge and impressive work of art. So, we got a bus for Tiruvannamalai and went around the temple, admiring the beautiful stone carvings and the huge towers. I had a good harvest of photographs. Someone suggested that we pay a visit to Sri Ramana Maharshi, who was living a couple of miles away. So we set out for the ashram in a horse cart. I wondered if the Maharishi would be a good subject for photography. It was evening by the time we arrived at the ashram. The visitors had dispersed from the hall. The Maharishi had gone out, as was his habit, for a short walk on the hill. We waited for a few minutes and saw a string of people following a tall man walking with a stick and holding a kamandalam, small vessel for water. We alerted ourselves and I asked if I could take a few photographs of the Maharishi. The reply was, "No, you cannot." As we were talking, the tall, stately figure approached us and asked what was the matter. Mr. Seshu Iyer, the man I had asked for permission, pointed to me and my colleagues and said, "This party are from Madras and they want to take some pictures of Bhagwan." "Oh, is that so?" said the Maharishi. "Let them." So saying, he stood posing for me with his hands on his hips and with his face in semi-profile. I lost no time. I opened my camera, brought it into focus and clicked 3 or 4 times, giving different apertures and different timings. I was not looking for any spiritual fare and I was not conscious of any holy atmosphere. Bhagwan, as they called him, entered the hall and lowered himself on the sofa which was carefully arranged for him. He put out a towel and wiped his wet feet, and then he sat recumbent on the sofa, seeming quite relaxed. It was surprising how he merged into himself, totally oblivious of the surroundings. We entered the hall and sat a few feet away in front of him. The Maharshi did not seem to take notice of anything around him. He wore a calm and distant look. His eyes were shining and there was something divine about his countenance. The hall was badly lit for photography, but still, I took a few pictures of the Maharshi. We then got up and mechanically prostrated before him and left the hall. Before we were out of the ashram compound, a sannyasi clad in orange robes came running after us and said, "Please send us a few prints to us at the ashram address. We do not have any good pictures of Bhagwan." This person was none other than Sri Niranjanananda Swami, the then Sarvadhikari. I left the ashram without giving any further thought to the matter and never suspected that it was to play a vital part in my life. I returned to Madras, developed the films, and sent a few prints to the ashram. Then I settled down to my studies. I had almost forgotten Tiruvannamalai. One morning, I received a letter inviting me to come and take a group photo with the Maharishi, as all the devotees were impressed with the good pictures that I had made. I wondered if this could not be put off till my examinations were over. But somehow I found myself entrained for Tiruvannamalai. When I entered the Maharishi's presence, he greeted me with a smile and said, "They want a group photo and they want you to take it for them." I was highly flattered and felt that I had done right in answering their call. To have been the object of Maharishi's remark was exquisitely pleasing. I felt quite important, arranged the group, erected my camera, and took a few pictures. Then Bhagwan posed for me in the conventional Padmasana. The ashram has sold many thousand copies of this particular pose of Bhagwan. Bhagwan sat almost statue-like, with a clean-shaven head. On another occasion, as I entered the hall, the Maharshi remarked, "Just now we were talking about you, and see the coincidence? You are here in person. You may yourself receive the letter personally which they have addressed ready for posting to you." Whenever I went to the ashram, though I usually stayed there only for one brief day, from morning till evening, I made it a point to accompany the Maharishi and take as many pictures of him as possible. I used to wonder if such doggedness on my part would not vex the Maharishi. I have snapped him walking, sitting, eating, cleaning his feet. I have snapped him smiling, bursting into laughter, smiling at a child, in a meditative mood, in samadhi, etc. Once, he was going up the hill when there was a slight drizzle, and he was offered a country-made palm leaf umbrella. I took a picture of him wearing this leaf on his head. I also took another picture of him using an ordinary umbrella. As I began to take this picture, the Maharishi was smiling broadly. In the few hours that I spent with the Maharishi, I felt charged with an inexplicable peace and contentment, and I returned home elated. The Maharishi seemed to be someone whom I knew intimately. I felt at home in his presence and even expected some sort of paternal indulgence and affection from him. I have no doubt that he did indulge me like a loving father. It is amazing how the thousands of visitors felt at ease in his presence and were made to feel that personal attention was bestowed upon each one of them. My short walks with the Maharishi gave me the rare opportunity of listening and taking part in the conversations. One day, as we were going up the hill, he picked up a small glistening pebble from the path and held it out to me, saying, "Someone from abroad has written asking for a stone taken from a holy part of this hill. He does not know that the whole hill is holy. This hill is Shiva himself. As we identify with the body, so Shiva has chosen to identify himself with this hill. Arunachala is pure wisdom, appearing in the shape of a hill. It is out of compassion to those who seek Shiva that Shiva has chosen to reveal himself as a hill, visible to the eye. The seeker will obtain guidance and solace by staying near this hill." These words sank into my heart. It never occurred to me to weigh or examine the aptness of what was said. The hill was holy. The Maharshi had said it, and that was what counted with me. Sometimes I used to wonder if it was not ridiculous of me to pay so much attention to photography, as his teaching was, "I am not the body." Was I not chasing the shadow and even trying to perpetuate it? Somehow, so long as I was meeting the Maharshi, his teaching did not assume any importance to me. This person was seen and felt by me, and I felt drawn and attracted to him. It gave me immense pleasure to take pictures of him. He was more important to me than his teaching. Every little movement, every one of his acts and gestures was highly valued by me, and they always carried some divine fragrance. Simply to watch him, no matter what he was doing, was highly gratifying. I was attracted to him like a baby to its mother. His Mahanirvana gave me a severe jolt. I was shocked. Had I missed the opportunity of a lifetime to imbibe the teaching of the enlightened one? I had done nothing in the direction of spiritual sadhana. Had I wasted all my time taking photographs, while I should have engaged myself in trying to understand and practice his teachings in his very presence? No, I said to myself, this cannot be true. I was sure that I had obtained some grace from the Maharshi. He was somehow still here. Only we have to learn to feel his presence. We would never be forsaken, for he had himself assured us that he was not going away. Then I turned with a sad heart to studying his teachings. I began to see light in them. Some of the sentences touched me and made me feel that I was in his presence, listening to him. I took heart. The more I read, the more intimate the Maharishi became to me. His teaching pulsated with life. I began to understand it and it mixed with my being and became my own. How I came to Maharishi. 4. Arthur Osborne. In September 1941, when my leave ended, the war was already drawing near to Siam, where I was employed as a university lecturer. So I left my wife and 3 children in India and went back alone. A friend had kindly opened to them his house at Tiruvannamalai. I went back without seeing Bhagwan. In December, the Japanese invaded Siam and I was arrested and interned. Just before that, I had received a letter saying that my eldest daughter, aged 5, and my son, 3 years younger, had asked Bhagwan to keep me safe through the war, and he had smiled and assented. There followed 3.5 long years of internment until the Japanese surrender in 1945. There was ample time for sadhana. More and more Bhagwan became the support of my strivings, though I did not yet turn to him as the Guru. As soon as the evacuation could be arranged, I went to Tiruvannamalai, arriving there at the beginning of October. And yet, it was as much to rejoin my family as to see Bhagwan that I went. Perhaps it would be more true to say that I simply felt I had to go there. I entered the ashram hall on the morning of my arrival, before Bhagwan had returned from his daily walk on the hill. I was a little awed to find how small it was and how close to him I should be sitting. I had expected something grander and less intimate. And then he entered, and, to my surprise, there was no great impression. Certainly, far less than his photographs had made. Just a white-haired, very gracious man, walking a little stiffly from rheumatism, and with a slight stoop. As soon as he had eased himself onto the couch, he smiled at me and then turned to those around and to my young son and said, "So Adam's prayer has been answered? His daddy has come back safely?" I felt his kindliness, but no more. I appreciated that it was for my sake that he had spoken English, since Adam knew Tamil. During the weeks that followed, he was constantly gracious to me, and the strain of nerves and mind gradually relaxed. But there was still no dynamic contact. I was disappointed, as it seemed to show a lack of receptivity in me. And yet, at the same time, it confirmed the opinion I had formed that he was not a guru and did not give guidance on any path. And Bhagwan did nothing to change my view. Until the evening of Kartikai, when each year a beacon is lit on the summit of Arunachala. Or it may have been Deepavali. I'm not quite sure. There were huge crowds for the festival, and we were sitting in the courtyard outside the hall. Bhagwan was reclining on his couch, and I was sitting in the front row before it. He sat up, facing me, and his narrowed eyes pierced into me, penetrating, intimate, with an intensity I cannot describe. It was as though they said, "You have been told. Why have you not realized?" And then quietness, a depth of peace, an indescribable lightness and happiness. Thereafter, love for Bhagwan began to grow in my heart, and I felt his power and beauty. Next morning, for the first time, sitting before him in the hall, I tried to follow his teaching by using the vichar. Who am I? I thought it was I who had decided. I did not at first realize that it was the initiation by look that had vitalized me and changed my attitude of mind. Indeed, I had heard only vaguely of this initiation and paid little heed to what I had heard. Only later did I learn that other devotees also had had such an experience, and that with them also it had marked the beginning of active sadhana under Bhagwan's guidance. My love and devotion to Bhagwan deepened. I went about with a lilt of happiness in my heart, feeling the blessing and mystery of the Guru, repeating like a song of love that he was the Guru, the link between heaven and earth, between God and me, between the formless being and my heart. I became aware of the enormous grace of his presence. Even outwardly, he was gracious to me, smiling when I entered the hall, signing to me to sit where he could watch me in meditation. And then one day a sudden vivid reminder awoke in me. The link with formless being? But he is the formless being. And I began to apprehend the meaning of his jnana and to understand why devotees addressed him simply as Bhagwan, which is a word meaning God. So he began to prove to me what he declared in his teaching, that the outer Guru serves to awaken the Guru in the heart. The vichar, the constant, who am I, began to awaken an awareness of the self as Bhagwan outwardly and also simultaneously of the self within. The specious theory that Bhagwan was not a Guru had simply evaporated in the radiance of his grace. Moreover, I now perceived that, so far from his teaching not being practical guidance, it was exclusively that. I observed that he shunned theoretical explanations and kept turning the questioner to practical considerations of sadhana, of the path to be followed. It was that, and that only, that he was here to teach. I wrote and explained this to the people who had misinformed me and, before sending the letter, showed it to him for his approval. He approved and handed it back, bidding me send it. Daily, I sat in the hall before him. I asked no questions, for the theory had long been understood. I spoke to him only very occasionally about some personal matter, but the silent guidance was continuous, strong, and subtle. It may seem strange to modern minds, but the Guru taught in silence. This did not mean that he was unwilling to explain when asked. Indeed, he would answer sincere questions fully. What it meant was that the real teaching was not the explanation, but the silent influence. The alchemy worked in the heart. I strove constantly by way of the vichar, according to his instructions. Having a strong sense of duty or obligation, I still continued, side by side with it, to use other forms of sadhana which I had undertaken before coming to Bhagwan, even though I now found them burdensome and unhelpful. Finally, I told Bhagwan of my predicament and asked whether I should abandon them. He assented, explaining that all methods only lead up to vichara. From the moment of my arrival at Tiruvannamalai, there had been no question of my leaving again. This was home. Even at the very beginning, when I was so mistaken about Bhagavan, even when material prospects seemed bleak. Perhaps that was why Bhagavan in his graciousness bestowed the initiation on one who sought but had not the wit to ask. This period of constant physical proximity lasted up to the beginning of 1948. I had never been in a financial position to make me suppose I should be able to spend nearly 3 years at an ashram. But circumstances adapt themselves to the will of Bhagavan. Not only did His grace keep me there, but it enabled me to go through the long period of unemployment and other trials and bereavement without undue anxiety. Although He never spoke of my difficulties or misfortunes, He flooded my heart with peace. Early in 1948, constant physical proximity had ceased to be necessary and professional work had become urgently necessary. Work was found in Madras. I took with me a life-size photograph of Bhagwan painted in oils, a gift from Dr. T. N. Krishnaswamy, a devotee and photographer. I showed it to Bhagwan before leaving, and he took it in his hands and returned it, saying, "He is taking Swami with him." Since then it has looked at me with the love and compassion of a guru, and spoken more profoundly than all other portraits. Thereafter I went to Tiruvannamalai only for weekends and holidays, and each visit was revitalizing. I was there at the time of one of the operations that Bhagwan suffered, and had darshan immediately after it. And the graciousness of his reception melted the heart and awoke remorse to think how great was the reward for so little effort made. I was there that fateful April night of the body's death, and felt a calm beneath the grief, and a wonder at the fortitude Bhagwan had implanted in his devotees to bear their loss. Gradually, one after another began to discover in his heart the truth that Bhagwan had not gone away, but as he promised, is still here. Since that day, his presence in the heart has been more vital, the outpouring of his grace more abundant, his support more powerful. I have been to Tiruvannamalai since then also, and the grace that emanates from his tomb is the grace of the living Ramana. During these years, I had felt no urge to write about Bhagwan. After his body's death and his reassurance, I am not going away. I'm here. Where could I go? There was a dream in which he called me up to him, and as I knelt before his couch, placed his hands on my head in blessing. At this time, an impulse came to write about Bhagavan, and especially to explain the accessibility of the path of self-inquiry, which he taught. How I came to Maharshi. 5. P.V. Sastry. Which is the greater miracle? To change the date on a tombstone, or to change a man's heart? In May 1945, my eldest son, who was 23 years old and married, who was a devout and a very promising young man, passed away. The event was so terrible and caused such grief that it was thought I would not survive it. I neglected practically all my worldly duties for some time. Later, I was somehow attracted to Ramanashramam and went there with my whole family. Ordinarily, people, under such circumstances, would go to obtain peace and get rid of their sorrow. But that was not my idea or my wife's. Having read about Sri Krishna's bringing Sandipani's son back to life, we were so mad as to think of getting our son restored to life by the grace of Bhagwan Sri Ramana. We were prepared to sacrifice everything for that. We left for Tiruvannamalai and reaching the ashram at 11 a.m., entered the hall where Bhagwan used to sit. Our one idea was to beseech him to bring our son back to life. But despite our intense desire, we found that we could not open our mouths to speak. We simply sat silent till Bhagwan rose for dinner, and everyone went out. Then we too went back to where we lodged. We went again in the afternoon, when devotees assembled in the hall with the same purpose, but with the same result. In that way, 8 days passed. Each morning and afternoon we wanted to implore Bhagwan to bring our son back to life, but we could not utter a word in his presence. On the 8th evening, we talked it over together on coming out of the hall, and decided that it was no use staying any longer since our purpose had not been fulfilled. So we decided to leave next morning. At that moment, a gentleman of the name of Subbarao met us. He was formerly a pleader, I think at Nellore, and had come to Tiruvannamalai and settled down as one of the resident devotees. We had made friends, perhaps because I am also a pleader. He asked me what we were talking about, so I told him our whole story. I admitted that we felt peace in Bhagwan's presence, but the moment we left the hall, our grief burst out again like a volcanic eruption. And yet, we were unable to speak out and put our desire before Bhagwan. Mr. Subbarao promised to take us to Sri Bhagwan next day and introduce us to him. We agreed, and next day, on being introduced, told Bhagwan about our grief and in a gentle way asked for his help. Sri Bhagwan nodded his head and said, "Seri, Seri. All right, all right." But we still found ourselves unable to talk any more, still less to tell him what it was that we really wanted. Again, we felt constrained to sit there speechless. That evening, we decided to leave, since even the intervention of Mr. Subbarao had not helped us. But Ramanna would not let us go. The thought occurred to me that I should buy some books published by the ashram. So I went to the bookstore. The gentleman in charge was in meditation, but he opened his eyes immediately and asked us to come in. On being questioned by him, I repeated our whole story. He said that the Maharshi was capable of bringing the boy back to life. But since the boy was a highly religious and really devout young man, he would have gone to better regions and would not like to come back to us. I assured him that he loved us so much and we loved him so much that he would really come back if it were possible. The gentleman then put another question to me. Suppose Bhagwan brings him back to you and then both of you die? What will the position be then? This question dispelled the thick cloud of illusion that had enveloped us, and at last we saw that our attempt to get our son back was sheer madness. I felt at the time, and still feel now, that it was not the bookseller that was talking to me, but really Bhagwan speaking through him. We abandoned the hope of getting our son back to life, and also our plan of leaving immediately. We stayed for about 12 more days, until our monetary resources were exhausted. The rest of our stay at the ashram was only for the purpose of obtaining peace. Sri Ramana's all right had been meant to help us in the only way in which a realized Guru will help. His grace was bestowed on us, and he began to work silently in our hearts to remove the thick clouds of sorrow and end the volcanic outbursts of grief. He began to instill peace and develop real knowledge in us. Silently and slowly, the grace is still working in that direction. What we wanted to have, we were actually prevented from asking for. We were also not allowed to go away in a mood of despair. We were blessed with His grace and uplifted in the right way. Because this is an experience of an extraordinary type, I feel that it is appropriate to make it known to all the devotees of Bhagwan. How I Came to Maharshi. 6. V. Kameshwara Rao. I had a dream one night many years ago in which a saintly old man with a short white beard blessed me with his benign and radiant smile and beckoned me to him. Sunrise put an end to sleep and dream alike, and I woke to find myself back in the dull routine of life. I went into the kitchen to tell my wife of my happy experience, but I could not identify the saint I had seen. Could it be Ramana Maharshi, about whom I had read in a book called Self-Realization? I asked a friend of mine who often went there whether he would take me with him, and he agreed. We set off that very day, arriving at Tiruvannamalai next morning. I found the ashram a quiet place with a few cottages and a meditation hall. We went straight into the hall, and there on a couch sat the Maharshi, the saint of my dream, clad only in a loincloth. I felt that I was in the presence of God. I fell prostrate before Bhagwan, for this was the name my friend used in addressing him. A group of silent men and women were seated on the floor on either side of him. Close to him, an elderly bearded man was sitting, binding a small book by hand. Bhagwan asked me whether I had had my coffee, so I went out and had a bath and breakfast. When I got back, I found that Bhagwan himself was stitching the book. I wondered why he should do it, and then I noticed how carefully he worked at it and how he showed the bearded man how to do it. God is all perfection. When a man realizes Godhead, he attains perfection. He also pays full attention to every detail. That was the thought that came to me when I saw Bhagwan binding the book. When we went for lunch, Bhagwan sat facing two groups of devotees, Brahmins to his right and non-Brahmins and non-Hindus to his left. I heard him tell the server that the rice was not well cooked. I was told that he himself was a good cook and had often worked in the ashram kitchen. As a government servant, I had to pass an examination in a second language within a prescribed period. The term was only a few months off. I decided to take it in Tamil, although I knew very little of the language. I was a bit worried about it, so I told an older devotee that I would like to have Bhagwan's blessings for my success. He took me to Bhagwan late in the evening, and I prostrated and told Bhagwan my trouble and asked for his blessing. He replied, "Parava illai, don't worry," which made me feel very happy. He advised me to take the little book, Nan Yar, Who Am I?, printed in English, Tamil, and Telugu, my own language, and read it with the help of a Tamil tutor. I woke early next morning and felt happy, waiting till sunrise to buy the books at the ashram bookstall. The night I first dreamed of Bhagwan, sunrise seemed to come too soon, but now I could hardly wait for it. Bhagwan passed outside the cottage where I was staying next morning. I went and prostrated before him and asked his permission to leave. He gave it, but asked why I was in such a hurry. My friend expressed a doubt whether I should be able to go that day, in view of what Bhagwan had said, but I had to get back. So after I had bought the books, we went to the station in the ashram bullock cart. When we got there, however, I was told that there was a 2-day strike on the railway, so we went back and told Bhagwan. He smiled. 2 days later, I asked again for leave to go, and he said, "Very well." This time we walked to the station and a cart followed us with our baggage. When we arrived, the train was already in, but the cart was not yet in sight, so I thought I would surely miss the train. But Bhagwan had said, "Very well." So I felt I should stop the train and indeed travel. I therefore went to the station master and told him that this was my second attempt to leave the ashram, and asked him to detain the train for a few minutes till my baggage arrived. And he agreed. Once I was in the train, I fell to pondering. When Bhagwan had asked me why I was in a hurry to leave, I couldn't leave, although I tried. When he gave the all clear, the train was stopped to take me. It worked both ways. He had also assured me of success in my Tamil test, although I knew scarcely a word of the language, and the test was to be held in a few months. I felt that it was hardly worth while engaging a tutor, but experience told me that Bhagwan was dependable. The train journey was sufficient proof. So when I got home, I engaged a tutor and stayed home during the summer recess of the law courts, reading Who Am I in Tamil. The written test came along. I had to translate an English speech into Tamil, and somehow I passed. Then there was the most frightening oral test in Madras, but it was made very easy and I passed that too. From one point of view, this whole test seemed to me useless, since there was no likelihood of my ever serving in Tamil Nadu. But from another point of view, it was a very necessary experience, since it confirmed my faith in Bhagavan. I could only judge him on my own level and in the light of my own experience, even if it was nothing more than a train journey or a Tamil test. In February 1949, my eldest son had a severe attack of smallpox. After a few days, the doctor warned me that many people were dying of it and that the chances of recovery were slight. I sat at the boy's bedside reading religious poems to him to keep his mind on God, since he was not expected to live. Then, on February 4th, the idea suddenly came to me to ask Bhagavan for his blessings, as we were in great distress. So I wrote to him, "Beloved Bhagavan, I pray for your blessings on the suffering child and his parents. Ever at your feet, we, Kameswar Rao." Early next morning, my sister, who had been taking her turn sitting by the boy during the night, told my wife and me that she had had a vision of Ammavaru, the spirit of smallpox, leaving a house and asking her to take care of the boy. She gathered from that, in accordance with popular belief, that the boy would recover and no one else in the house would get the disease. A few hours later, a friend came in and gave me some sacred ash from Sri Ramanashramam, another good omen. We all began to feel hopeful. On the 8th, I received the following letter from the ashram. Dear Sri Kameshwar Rao, we have your letter of the 4th inst, and the same was perused by Bhagavan. Prasadam, sacred ash, is herewith sent with Sri Bhagavan's gracious blessings for your child laid up with pox. Sri Bhagavan and Bhakts are well. Venkata Raman for Sarvatikari. The letter thrilled me. But how did Bhagavan know that my son had smallpox? Why ask? How could I know how Bhagavan knew? Anyway, my son survived and is in good health. I continued to be curious how smallpox came to be mentioned in the ashram letter. Some elderly person suggested that the moment Bhagwan saw my letter, he received a mental picture of my son bedridden with smallpox. Later, however, Sri Bhagavatula Annapurnaya Sastri of Tenali gave an explanation that appealed to me more. Was it necessary for you to write to Bhagwan in order for him to know what was happening in your house? Is he not all-pervading and all-knowing? But he does not interfere unless asked to and called upon. If a man is singing in Bombay and you want to hear him, you must switch on the radio. If you don't, the radio will not receive his song, and you will not hear it, although he is singing. Similarly, if you want Bhagwan's blessings, you must establish contact with him in the right way. My faith in Bhagwan increased enormously as a result of this, because it was a matter of life and death for my boy, and he gave him life. On 17th March 1949, a big ceremony was held at the ashram for the consecration of the temple of the shrine of Bhagwan's mother. I decided to go and take my family and my mother with me. I applied for 2 days casual leave, made all the arrangements, and came home at 2 p.m. A car was waiting at the door to take us to the station. Suddenly I felt that I should not go. My wife and mother naturally protested, but it was no use. Our baggage was taken out of the car. Everyone was annoyed about it, but I merely said, "Perhaps Bhagwan doesn't want me to see this function. I too am sorry, but I can't help it." At about 9 o'clock that evening, I received a telegram that the only son of my third sister was dangerously ill with meningitis, and that I should send my mother there at once. I put her on the train together with the sister who had looked after my own son when he had smallpox. On arrival, this sister wrote me a frantic letter saying that the case of my nephew was hopeless, and that the only chance of saving him, if at all, was to invoke the blessings of Bhagwan. So on March 30th, I again wrote to him. The following reply was received with the next day's date. Your letter of the 30th instant was received and placed before Sri Bhagwan. May Sri Bhagwan's blessings be on the child and his parents. Herewith, prasadam enclosed. My nephew recovered. We understood that why I suddenly had to cancel my journey to Thiruvannamalai. If we had gone, the telegram would not have reached me. My mother and sister would not have gone in time, and I would not have written to ask Bhagwan for his blessings. Hence my erratic decision, prompted by something unknown to me at the time. Came the fateful year 1950, when Bhagwan left his body. Physically, he is no more with us, but he remains forever in our hearts. There are thousands of humble folk like me who received from beloved Bhagwan things they could never return, nor was any return expected. God fulfills human needs so that man may develop divine discontent. It is human nature to get and forget. It is divine nature to give and forgive. Man is God's child. Just as a parent satisfies the childish needs of a child, even though they may be ultimately unnecessary, so too does God satisfy the immediate, though temporary needs of man, so as to stimulate a desire for the ultimate and eternal need, the need to attain Godhead. Arthur Osborne wrote in The Incredible Sai Baba that Baba used to say, "I give people what they want in the hope that they will begin to want what I want to give them." How I came to Maharshi. 7. Dr. Lieutenant Colonel P.V. Karamchandani. Normally, as soon as I place my head on the pillow, I fall asleep. One night, in February 1949, at Vellore, for no conscious reason, I could not sleep and kept tossing in bed. This was something very unusual. At 1 a.m., a telephone call came from Thiruvannamalai, a place 55 miles away, asking me to reach there by 8 a.m., as Bhagwan Ramana was very ill. Having received the call, I fell sound asleep. I was the district medical officer of North Arcot then, and Thiruvannamalai was within my jurisdiction. I reached Thiruvannamalai without any emotion. My only thought was that I was on a professional mission of attending on a patient. The sainthood of Bhagwan Ramana had no significance for me. I examined Bhagwan Ramana. He had cancer of the main nerve, high up in the arm. I gave my prescription and returned to Vellore the same day. I had conducted my examination of Bhagwan Ramana in a strictly professional manner. I carried no spiritual feelings for him, nor did he speak a word with me. But he had directed a momentary gaze of grace at me, which kept stirring my mind deeply. Involuntarily, I felt that a new vista of spiritual consciousness had opened out before me. The wondrous gaze of Bhagwan seemed to envelop me with an aura of bliss. The spiritual pull from him felt so irresistible that after a few days I myself arranged a visit to Thiruvannamalai, just for the sake of having his darshan. I took my wife with me. We visited Bhagwan with a sense of curiosity and an undefinable sense of expectation. We made our obeisance and sat by his feet. We did not speak a word, nor did he speak. No speech seemed necessary. So surcharged with spirituality was he that his spirituality wafted out to us, completely enveloping us. Serenity seeped into us. Our minds attained the state of blissful, ecstatic meditation. The tumor that Bhagwan was bearing must have given him the most excruciating, nerve-wracking pain. Such writhing pain would have made the toughest man wince and moan. But Bhagwan's face was serene, smiling and radiant. All of a sudden, a disciple accidentally touched only the fringe of the thin bandage that was covering Bhagwan's tumor. Bhagwan gave an involuntary start. The disciple felt bewildered and mumbled, "Bhagwan, did I hurt you?" "It was only the fringe of the bandage that my hand touched." Bhagwan smiled his benign smile and softly said, "You do not know the enormous weight, as of a mountain, that this fringe bears." The chance exclamation of Bhagwan indicated the severity of his pain, but his godly face did not bear the slightest sign of his agony. It reflected only joy and peace. He seemed to have switched off his mind from the body, keeping it solely on the divine. The next occasion when I was summoned to Bhagwan's presence was when he had developed anuria. I now went to his ashram not with the all-important feeling of a district medical officer going to visit his patient. I went in the spirit of a humble devotee going to serve a saint of colossal spiritual magnitude. My ministrations as a doctor were now coupled with the devotion of a disciple. When I reached the ashram, I was told that for the past 24 hours Bhagwan had not taken any food, nor even a drop of water, that the disciples' implorations in this behalf had failed, and that, in consequence, the entire community was feeling most anxious. I was entreated to persuade Bhagwan to eat something. On examining Bhagwan, I found that it was imperative that he should take some fluid. But what if he refused my request too? Ordering him in my capacity as a doctor seemed to be out of question. I felt I could only ask him as a boon to accept my prayer. I prayed inwardly and held a glass of buttermilk before him. He gazed at me for a second, took the buttermilk in shaking hands, and drank it. My joy knew no bounds. There was relief and jubilation all around. I was thanked profusely, but I felt infinitely grateful for Bhagwan's overwhelming grace. He had heard my silent prayer and granted my boon. Wonderful was the spiritual exhilaration I experienced in Bhagwan's holy presence. The next time I was called to him was at midnight. When I entered his room, 4 disciples were there. Bhagwan was saying something to them in Tamil. They told me that he was asking them to leave the room, but that they wanted to stay, as according to them, He was in delirium. I persuaded them to go. 3 of them went away. The 4th one stayed on. Bhagwan turned to him and whispered, "You're not going away because you feel that you love me more than the others." The disciple now knew that Bhagwan was not delirious. He bowed and went. I was left alone with Bhagwan. As usual, he did not speak with me. I was also silent. But the vibrations that emanated from him were celestial. His body must have been in terrible mortal pain, but his heavenly spirituality was unaffected by it. A rapturous thrill electrified my entire being. I administered to his body, but I was hardly conscious that I was a district medical officer. I was conscious only of an intense desire to worship this illumined soul. I had learnt that Bhagwan did not allow devotees to touch his feet. But I felt a deep urge within me not only to touch his blessed feet, but to press them lovingly. I took courage in both my hands and pressed them. Wonder of wonders! Bhagwan let me do so. His grace was abounding. I considered myself in the 7th heaven. I glorified those few minutes of my life. The next time I was summoned to him was about 3 hours after midnight. Pain must have been torturing his body. Still, he was sound asleep. Holy silence filled the room. It was dawn. I did not wish to disturb him. I sat quietly by his feet. Suddenly, he opened his eyes. His gracious gaze fell on me. He softly muttered, "DMO." The peculiar tone in which he said this indicated that I had been in his sacred thoughts and that he was expecting me. I felt myself blessed. I silently worshipped him. My whole being seemed to vibrate with ecstasy. At that time, I had been feeling restless about promotion to the rank of Major General, Sergeant General, which was legitimately due to me as the senior-most IMS officer in the province of Madras. Though I tried to banish the idea of that coveted promotion from my mind, it loomed large before me and marred my equanimity. Then I said to myself, why am I fretting unnecessarily? Next time I visit Bhagwan, I shall request him to grant me this promotion. When I visited the ashram again, I went before Bhagwan with my mind resolutely set on requesting him for this boon. But a marvel happened. As soon as I saw Bhagwan, my mind melted, the resolution evaporated, and I was filled with strange contentment. A request did formulate itself within me, but it was an entirely different request. I inwardly prayed, Bhagavan, free me from my craving for this promotion. I don't want anything mundane. Instead, grant me my soul's evolution. My prayer seemed to be instantly granted. Effulgent joy flooded the very depths of my being. I reverently bowed before Bhagwan and he gazed at me benevolently. My last visit to Bhagwan was on the day he attained nirvana. I have described it in my saintly galaxy. How on visiting him, I found that his body would not last beyond that day. How I silently prayed that he might retain his body till I brought my wife from Bellore. How she brought orange juice for him. How he would not accept any drink at all. How once again inwardly I implored him to drink the orange juice to save my wife from deep disappointment. How he accepted my unspoken prayer and asked for orange juice, to the transcendental delight of my wife and myself, and how shortly afterwards, in utter tranquility, he passed on. It was a scene of great and somber beauty. During my 2 months' contact with Bhagavan, I did not speak a single word with him. But what wonderful grace he poured into me through his benign, benevolent gaze! A peerless spiritual experience, indeed. How I came to Maharshi. 8. Swami Ramdas. In his early autobiography, In Quest of God, published by Anandashram, Kanhangad, Swami Ramdas describes how he attained the divine vision through the grace of the Maharshi. Years later, he told this story to Dilip Kumar Roy, who reproduced it in his latest book, The Flute Called Still, published by Indira Niloy, Hari Krishna Mandir, Pune. Since some parts of the story are more detailed in one account and some in the other, we have combined them. Papa, I said, would you mind telling me about your final realization, which they call Vishwarupa Darshan? He, Swami Ramdas, readily acquiesced and gave a long description of his burning aspiration and yearning, which had led him to Arunachala hill, hallowed by the tapas of the peerless saint Bhagwan Ramana Maharshi. I give here only the gist of his long narration. One day the kind Sadhu Ram took Ramdas for the darshan of a famous saint of the place named Sri Ramana Maharshi. His ashram was at the foot of Arunachala. It was just a thatched shed. The visitors entered the ashram and, meeting the saint, fell prostrate at his holy feet. It was really a blessed place where that great man lived. He was young, but there was in his face a calmness, and in his large eyes a passionless look of tenderness, which cast a spell of peace and joy on all those who came to him. Ramdas was overjoyed that the saint knew English, so he addressed him thus: Maharaj, here stands before thee a humble slave. Have pity on me. His only prayer to thee is to give him thy blessing. The Maharshi turned his beautiful eyes towards Ramdas and looked intently for a few minutes into his eyes, as though he was pouring into Ramdas his blessing through those orbs, then shook his head to indicate that he had blessed him. A thrill of inexpressible joy coursed through Ramdas, his whole body quivering like a leaf in the breeze. Now, at the prompting of Sadhuram, Ramdas desired to remain in solitude for some time. Sadhuram was ever ready to fulfill his wishes. Losing no time, he took Ramdas up the mountain Arunachala behind the great temple. Climbing high up, he showed him many caves. Of these, one small cave was selected for Ramdas, which he occupied next day. In this cave he lived for nearly a month in deep meditation. This was the first time he was in solitude for his bhajan. Now he felt the most blissful sensations, since he could hold undisturbed communion with Lord Ram. He was rolling in a sea of indescribable happiness. To fix the mind on that fountain of bliss, Lord Ram, means to experience pure joy. He went on taking the name in an ecstasy of longing when, lo, suddenly his Lord Ram appeared before him and danced and danced. Did you see him with closed eyes or open? I interjected. With open eyes, as Ramdas is seeing you, Papa answered. But it was not this momentary vision that Ramdas's heart craved, for he knew that a vision like this was unlikely to last, and so, when the Lord vanished, Ramdas reverted to his darkness. Therefore he prayed for the great darshan, the vision of visions, which comes to stay forever, so that there is no more parting, namely the Vishwarupa darshan. Seeing Ram always in everything, nothing less would satisfy Ramdas. Papa paused and then resumed with a beatific smile. And it came one morning when lo, the entire landscape changed. All was Ram, nothing but Ram. Wherever Ramdas looked, everything was ensouled by Ram, vivid, marvelous, rapturous. The trees, the shrubs, the ants, the cows, the cats, the dogs, even inanimate things pulsated with the marvelous presence of the one Ram. And Ramdas danced in joy, like a little boy who, when given a lovely present, can't help breaking out into a dance. So it was with Ramdas. He danced with joy and rushed at a tree which he embraced, because it was not a tree but Ram himself. A man was passing by. Ramdas ran towards him and embraced him, calling out, "Ram, oh Ram!" The man got scared and bolted. But Ramdas gave him chase and dragged him back to his cave. The man noted that Ramdas had not a tooth in his mouth, and so felt a little reassured. At least the loony would not be able to bite him. Swami Ramdas laughed out, and we swelled the chorus. "And then?" I asked, after the laughter had subsided. "The bliss and joy came to be permanent, like a torrent rushing downhill till it finds the placid level of a limpid, purling stream. This experience is called Sahaj Samadhi, in which you can never be cut off from the consciousness of being at one with the one who has become all, in which you feel you are one with all because you have perceived that all is He, the one without a second." Finally, we end with a comment made by Swami Ramdas in Vision, the monthly journal published by Anandashram about 40 years later. Ramdas went to Ramana Maharshi in a state of complete obliviousness of the world. He felt thrills of ecstasy. In his presence, the Maharshi made the awakening permanent in Ramdas. Some people said to Ramdas, "You went to Maharshi and you got illumination. Give us illumination like that." Ramdas replied, "You must come to Ramdas in the same spirit and in the same state as he went to the Maharshi. Then you will also get it. Where was his heart? How intense was his longing? What was the world to him at that time? If you come in that state, it is all right." How I came to Maharshi. 9. R. Narayan Iyer. It was in the year 1928 or maybe 1929. I was employed at Chetput, a township 30 miles from Tiruvannamalai. My only friend and constant companion there was Dr. V. Ramakrishna Iyer, a versatile man of many parts, rather religious, but not of the orthodox type, very genial and entertaining, one whom I now deem a Purushottama, best of men, a friend, philosopher, and guide, as he subsequently proved to be. I was just the opposite in my makeup, an out-and-out skeptic with no religion in me, scoffing in my references to sadhus, sannyasis, and swamis, whom I considered impostors and parasites on society, who exploited credulous folk for personal ends, and accepted homage and hero worship as though they were superior to ordinary men. Dr. Ramakrishna Iyer is the son of the late Lakshmi Ammal, a friend and playmate of Sri Bhagwan in his boyhood days at Tiruchuchi, to which place she also belonged. He was therefore well acquainted with Bhagwan and was an occasional visitor to Sri Ramanashramam. He once invited me to go to Tiruvannamalai with him during the festival of Kartigai Deepam. Although I disliked the crowds and the insanitary condition of the town, and although the pomp and pageantry of the temple festival had no attraction for me, I agreed not wishing to hurt his feelings, but requested to be left with my parents, who had gone for the festival and were staying in the town, while he went on to the ashramam in search of his favorite pursuits. He agreed and took me to the place where they were staying. But on seeing the number of families huddled in the small house, I told my friend, "Doctor, I cannot stay here. There is not even breathing space. Your ashram will have plenty of open air and sunshine and the shade of trees. I would rather go there and stay outside while you go in and have your way." He said, "Yes," and took me to the ashramam, a mile or so from the town. On the way, I repeated my opinion of the so-called holy men and said to him, "I will not come in or join in any of your tomfoolery. If by chance I meet your Swami, I will not prostrate before him. I mean no insult, but I cannot do what is against my convictions. I don't believe that any man, however great, has the right to accept the homage of others, just because he has learned to memorize and quote scriptures or sacred lore." With this warning to my friend, we came to the ashramam. It was then comprised of 3 thatched sheds, a little away from the road, which one reached by a narrow footpath through thorn bushes. We walked in. A man in a white loin cloth, a towel on his shoulder, a kamandalu in one hand, and a walking stick in another, stopped in his walk in the opposite direction on seeing us. The doctor hastened his steps and I followed slowly. The doctor was greeted very kindly and was asked about the welfare of his mother and brother. It must be the Maharshi, I thought. But I didn't look up as he was a complete stranger to me. Then I heard my friends saying, "This is the sub-registrar of Chetpur." Out of courtesy, I looked at him. What a wonderful face, and what a welcoming smile. Bewitching, fascinating, and a powerful look, too. In a moment, I was at his feet on the gravel ground. I soon regained my self-possession and felt ashamed. I should not have been so hasty in expressing my views to the doctor, I thought. 2 persons whom I had seen before had impressed me with their powerful personality, Mahatma Gandhi and Rabindranath Tagore. This person surpasses them, I said to myself. He's not bogus. He looks genuine. Yet I must find out from him how he is entitled to the homage of others and how he accepts it. Has he solved the mystery of life, the universe that we see around us? If not, I withdraw my homage and go my way. With a pleasing smile, he said, "You have a couple of days' leave, is it not so? You can stay in the ashram. I will be there in a few minutes." I dared not say anything. I was dazed. I soon recovered and tried to find out if he had written any book. I got a copy of Reality in 40 verses in Tamil, just published. I tried to read the first stanza. I could not follow it. The word Uladu seemed too closely packed and somehow jumbled together. What? I thought. Can he not say what he has to say in intelligible language? Someone nearby said that it had been arranged that the Maharshi himself would explain to us the 40 verses that night. I prevailed upon my friend to prolong our visit. This time it was his turn to be amazed. In anxious and eager suspense, I waited for the night. The Maharshi sat on a raised pile or dais inside a shed containing his mother's samadhi. Apparently, he used to remain there most of the time. Night came. About half a dozen of us were seated on the ground before him. A solemn stillness pervaded the air. There was absolute silence, except for the occasional chirping of a bird or the hooting of an owl. The Maharshi read the first stanza. The mere reading of the stanza made the meaning as clear as clarity itself. Stanza by stanza he read and explained in a voice so sweet and melodious that seemed to come from a transcendent somewhere. The climax came. Explaining a verse, he said, God cannot be seen with our eyes or known by our sense perceptions. This is what is meant by saying, to see God is to be God. One man from the small audience, a stalwart person with a severe expression, named Dandapani Swami, interposed. Is Bhagwan saying this out of personal experience? The question, asked bluntly with such naivete, was answered with equal candor. Else, would I dare to say so? The Maharshi replied. Enough. It set me thinking furiously. It flashed upon me in a moment. To see God is to become God. God cannot be known by our sense faculties. The only way is to be God. If he whom all religions acclaim to be God were to appear before me in flesh and blood, here he is. My body thrilled from somewhere deep down in me. Again and again, thrill after thrill sent me quivering and shook my frame. I went out to compose myself. I came. He saw. He conquered. How I came to Maharshi. 10. Rosalind, Christian. As several devotees have rightly remarked, the correct title for any such essay should be How the Maharshi Came to Me, rather than the other way round. This applies more especially to me than some others, for I live in a country, England, thousands of miles away from Tiruvannamalai. It is a small country whose dangerous and rocky coast demands a great number of warning lights for shipping. 3 such lights are visible from my home, and it is an astonishing sight to see those beacons, shining out across miles of water, rock and surf as, on the most bitter, stormy and treacherous nights, they answer one another flash by flash. What an apt allegory this is of the power of a great rishi to pierce the darkness of ignorance, a power that annihilates time and space. So, as I see it, the Maharishi's finger of light touched me before I was aware of his name or even knew of his existence. One night, I had a dream which, though very short, was of extraordinary clarity and beauty, quite unlike the usual half-real meanderings I was used to. In my dream, I saw a strip of rich material laid out before me. It had a glowing sheen and an indescribable richness of color. On this cloth lay a tiny piece of fluted branch or twig. This, as I watched, spellbound, turned into a most attractive and elegant little key. I remember thinking as I rose up through layers of sleep into full consciousness, what a strange power must exist inside me to perform such an effortless trick before the mind's eye, something no film camera could do. The memory of this dream was exceedingly vivid, and I pondered a great deal over the color of the fabric I had seen, a rich terracotta red. Did it speak of the soil of our mother, earth? Did it speak of the Muladhara chakra, said to be red, and which are endowed with the same rich color? I was puzzled, but could find no solution. To find no point or meaning in a dream which seemed so full of vibrant power was sad and disappointing. Several months later, perhaps more than a year, a friend gave me 2 books. This is the Guru for you, she said, or something of that sort. I mentioned 1 or 2 great known to me, and was surprised, even amused, and the way she brushed them aside with the gesture of a hand. The two books were Ramana Arunachala and Ramana Maharshi and the Path of Self-Knowledge by Arthur Osborne. I ought perhaps to give my thanks here to Arthur Osborne, whose dedicated work presented the Maharshi to the Western reader. It is a rare gift indeed to be able to interpret one culture to another, especially on the spiritual level. For me, as for so many others, to meet Bhagavan was immediately to love him, and to love him implies to follow so far as one is able. I had come, though I did not know it at first, to Arunachala, the red hill, whose effulgent, glowing light is Shiva incarnate. Thus part of my dream was fulfilled, though there was much more to come. Arunachala, they say, is a wish-fulfilling hill. And Arthur Osborne tells us how he was cautioned as he made his first pilgrimage around the hill to be careful, not to wish for anything. Anywhere else, he writes, the saying would have sounded absurd. But Bhagwan sought, like Buddha, to free us not so much from our misfortune as from the wishes and desires, the fears and the attachments which make misfortunes possible. And yet I have read elsewhere that Mr. Osborne in his younger days had longed to be a poet, and that this yearning was at last fulfilled when, as a devotee of the Maharshi and as editor of the Mountain Path, he found both the subject and the vehicle of poetic inspiration. Arunachala is a wish-fulfilling hill. Mr. Osborne had already wished, it seems, before he ever set foot on its slopes. My condition is almost the same, for even as a child I longed to be an archaeologist. I was prevented. The war came. Now other work and ties grew up. Now under Bhagwan's guidance I have become something of an archaeologist here in Scotland on my own. Not, I hasten to say, an archaeologist in the ordinary sense. I have not the training. I merely look at the relics of Scotland's ancient people in the light of Maharshi's teaching. As I look, the stones and sculpture of the ancient Celts take on a deeper meaning, and not only the stones, but the stories and customs that are linked with them. How I came to Maharshi. 11. Robert Moore. The proper title here should be How Bhagwan Came to Me, long before I recognized him. A boy of 12 years stood in front of a mirror and saw his own image staring at him like a stranger and asked deep within, what is this shell, this cocoon, which houses so many emotions, thoughts, and far deeper something which observes all this as a detached spectator? What am I? Who am I? This sequence persisted for several weeks, each time the mirror was confronted. But being born in Australia, with the Western teachings of God who reigned above, somewhere and apart from his devotees, I could only be reached through earnest attendance at church and Sunday school, and threatened hell's fire for any breach of his teaching. The lad did not follow this line of inquiry for some years afterwards. He rebelled at the idea of enforced collective worship in church, led by minister, priest, or padre, who seemed empowered to forgive sins, yet were ordinary men who often transgressed their professed ideals the moment they removed their vestments after a service. He thought that God was our Father, so how could he bear his children suffer punishment in hell? He felt that God was immanent in every living being, in plants, insects, earth and sea, in everything on this planet as we know it. He was there. And God being within us, why not we be devoted to Him and love Him in our own quiet way, just as we love our parents, family, wife, and friends? This boy's father was taken away from the family group when he was only 3 years old, and
he was being the youngest of 11 children, was always looked upon as too young to know anything. Consequently, he found none to answer his earnest questions regarding his views upon and feelings towards God and worship. He kept his convictions to himself, always feeling out of place with violence, bullying, and games which asserted domination over other people, always believing that a good loser felt happier than a bad winner and dogged by self-consciousness. His happiness, his happiest moments were when he could be with nature, feeling, as he described it, a feeling of freedom watching plants grow and animals and birds free in their natural environment, all following their own inherent natures so unlike humans, who clouded their lives with dreams and delusions and only looked to their physical needs and judged their fellow man by the size of his pocket and possessions. The feeling persisted always that something lay beyond the accepted orthodox teachings, that an observer within watched everything with detachment, but he was unable to find the key to the puzzle. After completing studies in automotive electrical engineering, this young man spent years in pandering to physical demands, always paying lip service to God and postponing his inner search. He worked in New Guinea among very young souls, who, though closely resembling primeval man, were still endowed with a type of mental telepathy. In his 34th year, cancer was detected in his system, and he was told that if the affliction became active, death could result in 24 hours. Instead of panic, there immediately arose in him the question, if I die, what is left? What spiritual advancement has the soul made? Who am I? What really dwells within? The only answer he could find was that the soul or spirit would leave the body behind, like a beautiful butterfly leaving an empty cocoon as a shell and nothing more, not knowing what happened to it. He realized that man dies 100 deaths by his recurring fears and phobias. Yet, when one is faced with actual death, one realizes that God alone decides when and how. In this instance, God decided by a simple operation to preserve this body for a few years more in order to learn a little more. In his 36th year, this man, while walking along a New Guinea beach alone one night, feeling sad and full of self-pity, stopped to admire the stars, and on reflecting that some of those stars were far, far bigger than the earth and our sun as we know them, and yet looked so small, suddenly realized how tiny and egoistic man is, who blames others for his misfortune and trying situations in life because he won't face himself. In his 37th year, this man met Marie, a devout disciple of Sri Ramana Maharshi. This was not man meeting woman, but soul meeting soul. And at long last, someone who felt as he felt, inquired as he had inquired, and could answer to Bhagwan all. The man who throughout his life had been self-conscious turned suddenly conscious of the self, and like a flower open to the light of his grace, Jesus comes into perspective. Suddenly passages in the Holy Bible take on new meaning. Love thy neighbor as thyself. In my Father's house there are many mansions, levels of consciousness and spiritual advancement. To come to Ramanashramam is to come home. Bhagwan's advice to put all your luggage on the train applies so much to all of us. To have faith in Bhagwan completely means leaving everything in his hands. Whatever is meant to be, will be. It is a long road to liberation, but what a labor of love. Now this man of 42 years thanks Bhagwan forever for the many blessings he had been receiving, the complete peace of mind and spirit, the miracle of this body, the wonder of nature, everything within and without, and above all, His grace. I feel forever humble that this man is being shown the path, the only desire left now. I know there should be no desire, but then I'm not yet perfect. Is to be perfect and one with the Absolute. This body may travel back to Australia, but the heart remains with Arunachala at the feet of Bhagwan.
How I Came to Maharshi. 12. H.R. Chadha. The author became our first subscriber in peculiar circumstances. When the mountain path was still a project, and we had not publicly announced our plans, he had a dream in which Sri Bhagwan appeared to him with some magazines. Taking this to mean that there was an ashram magazine, he wrote to the ashram president asking to be enrolled as a subscriber. This was confirmation that Sri Bhagwan's hand was guiding the mountain path. Sri Chadha is an active member of Ramana Kendra, Calcutta. My father was running a sport goods concern with several branches in northwest India, such as Sialkot, Rawalpindi, etc., now in Pakistan, and some branches in Uttar Pradesh. He was a hard worker. My mother was very pious, and when I was hardly 6 months old, a sannyasi who came for Piksha told her that I would be a very rich man in due course. I left Sialkot College in 1919, and the parting advice of my principal was, "You are the son of a businessman. So remember, if a customer comes to you for a coat and if you do not sell him a pair of trousers as well, you are no salesman." After father's demise in 1928, I had to take an active part in business and go on several tours. Though married and blessed with children, all of them died between 1923 and 1939. The last child foretold his death, and particularly after his death, I was very much struck with grief. Some years passed on in such a sorrowful mood. It was the year 1943. In my search for peace, I surrendered myself to Sri Swami Sivananda of Rishikesh. I requested his permission for staying in his ashram for the rest of my life, but he would not give it. He said, "You will have to go back. You are destined to earn lakhs of rupees and spend them." But I persisted in my entreaties, saying that I had suffered enough in the world, and I had no other alternative than to renounce. Just then there was a telegram asking me to go over to Lahore immediately. Swamiji also produced the telegram and remarked with a hearty laugh, "You did not obey me, but you will obey this paper." I went to Lahore and, reaching Madras eventually, opened a canteen there. This did fetch me lakhs of rupees. Meanwhile, Swami Sivananda also wrote to me, advising me that I should visit Sri Ramana Maharshi. Learning of Maharshi's greatness from Paul Brunton's book and my neighbor also, I decided to go to Tiruvannamalai. I went straight to Sri Bhagwan in the hall, which was just full. I was rewarded by his graceful smile, and it looked as though he was waiting for me. It was a delicate moment since there was no room for sitting, and to keep standing also looked odd. Maharshi looked at me and, without speaking anything outwardly, conveyed this to me. The driver and guard of a train are far apart, but they move at the same speed and are connected throughout. You can sit in that corner and you will be connected with the guard. I obeyed this command and I felt his grace vividly. One morning, I went up to the Maharshi with a doubt in my mind but said nothing. I was curious about the state of the soul after death. He had a book brought out from his shelf by Sri Sivananda, one of his attendants. On opening the book,
I felt that my doubt was cleared by the contents of that page. I do not exactly remember the title of the book. I repeated my visit. It was an elevating experience beyond description. One day I was commanded by Sri Bhagavan inwardly to leave the ashram immediately. I did so, and returned to my headquarters to find that the army chief was on a surprise visit to our camp. My absence would have landed me in a difficult situation. I have now the opportunity to talk of his glory and hear other devotees at the Ramana Kendra, Calcutta. There cannot be a greater solace and blessing at this stage of my life. Maharshi has blessed me in so many ways that I cannot be sufficiently grateful to him, nor can I describe his greatness adequately. How I came to Maharshi. 13. Surya Prakash. I come from a family with spiritual leanings. My father was a great devotee of saints. I grew up under the influence of the profound, all-embracing Sindhu culture of pre-partition days, which was a wonderful synthesis of the Hindu Advaitic teachings, the highly devotional teachings of the Sikh gurus, and Muslim Sufi cult of complete identity with the divine. Although this rich heritage was destroyed while I was still young and I had to leave for other parts of India, the seed had already been sown. It was about 1940 when I first read about Bhagwan Ramana in Paul Brunton's Search in Secret India. This aroused a vague desire in me to have his darshan at some future date, if it became conveniently possible, but no stronger impetus. After independence and partition, I settled with my family in Bombay. Late in 1948, I went with two others on a business trip to Bangalore. There, one night, the urge suddenly came to me, for no apparent reason, to go to Tiruvannamalai and have darshan of the Maharshi, since we were already so near. I raised the question with my friends, but they strongly opposed the idea of going to a jungle hermitage at the foot of some mountain, which is how they put it. So I too gave up the idea of coming. Somehow the matter came up again in 2 days later. This time my friends relented, but on the specific condition that we should not stay more than 1 day at the hermitage. I agreed. So we came, and we stayed for 10 days. That in itself is commentary enough. Actually, when we did leave, we had to tear ourselves away, and it was only because we refused a further extension of our stay. Some readers may need to be reminded that the accommodation at Sri Ramanashramam has mostly been built since the lifetime of the Maharshi. At that time, there was very little accommodation for visitors. I may say that one of my two companions was a relative of mine, a well-to-do landlord of about 60, whose whole philosophy of life was to eat, drink, and be merry. He had no spiritual leanings. The impact on him was tremendous. Why was he brought here? Why are some chosen for grace and others apparently not? It is a mystery. He was so moved that he would bend down and touch my feet, an unheard of thing from an elder to a junior, telling me that I had shown him God face to face in this very life. Soon after this, he died, completely at peace with himself. As for me, while sitting in Bhagwan's presence, the first morning of my visit, I was completely unaffected. In fact, during the lunch hour, we were planning our departure next morning. But while I was sitting before Bhagwan in the afternoon, something that I had never known before happened to me. In spite of myself, I closed my eyes and imperceptibly, but without the slightest doubt, a sense of utter blessedness suffused my innermost being, And for the first time in my life, I had the experience of absolute and complete well-being. I have no better words to describe it. I was told later that Bhagwan was gazing intently at me during this time. The spell was cast for good. I did not speak a single word with Bhagwan. It was not necessary. I read some of the ashram publications. Much of his reading was beyond me at that time. I did not even try to understand. Only I knew that I had perfect repose in myself. I felt I had touched divinity. I came back in 1949. I was here again during the first week of April 1950, the last month of Bhagwan's life on earth. I have been 3 more times since he discarded the body, the present being my 6th and longest stay of nearly 2 months. With the passage of time, I have tried to understand Bhagwan's teachings and, in my imperfect way, have followed the path of self-inquiry taught by him. Side by side with it, I have also followed the path of Nam Jap, calling on the name. By the infinite grace of Bhagwan, I have known that the deeps of peace and tranquility are within me. Indeed, that I am that. Day after day, I am becoming surer of myself. Finally, let me mention a small incident. Towards the end of 1958, I visited the ashram together with Miss Francoise Lamotte, a Belgian lady who was at that time working with the United Nations. We came by car, she for the first time. As we approached Tiruvannamalai, I was driving and I pointed out Arunachala to her from a distance. On looking at it, she had an upsurge of such emotion within her that she was almost speechless. After a few minutes, all she could say was, "I feel as if I'm going home." Yes, it feels like one's homecoming each time one comes here. This time, however, I have prayed to Bhagwan to be with me everywhere and all the time, so that wherever I am, Bhagwan is, and I am always and everywhere at home. How I came to Maharshi. 14. R.O. Aminu. I am a Muslim, born 52 years ago, and my parents brought me up as a devoted follower of the faith I was born into. This was shown by my ability, due to the grace of God, to complete the Quran reciting by the age of 15 years. This was unusual even in those days at the normal age. Then to finish the Quran was between 25 to 30 years. Later on in life, after the secondary education, I began to ponder about the assertion of Muslim leaders who told us that you have to keep certain rules, otherwise you will end up in hell after death, where one's body will be consumed by fire. These utterances of Maulvis made me disillusioned about the truth of their preaching, and this was made worse by the fact that although I could recite the whole Quran by memory, I did not understand its meaning. In fact, there was no translation of Quran into Yoruba or English in those days. Millions of people in Nigeria are Muslims, and less than 10% understand Arabic. This may be termed as blind faith, but it works. Due to Sri Maharishi's grace, I was privileged to come across a book in 1959 written by Yogi Ramacharaka entitled 14 Lessons of Yoga. The contents of these lessons made a profound impression on my mind, particularly the realization that plants, animals, and human beings possess one life force or God. From then on, I started reading different yoga books. Then I began to see that orthodox religions, Islam, Christianity, and Hinduism, teach the same truth, that the kingdom of God is within them. not up in the clouds, and that we are punished by our own sins or karma, not by God at all. However, due to my desire to find out more about life, I became an infinite way student and studied the teaching of Joel Goldsmith in 1964. I was attracted to the infinite way through the book called Contemplative Life. The regular reading of the monthly letters and constant meditation enabled me to realize for the first time that the truth which all of us are searching for is within our own consciousness. In 1964, I read about the mountain path in the Infinite Way monthly letters, and I immediately became a life subscriber. And since that time, I have been receiving regularly the mountain path, including the early copies of 1964. I found the articles I read in it very illuminating, but very difficult to follow the teachings of Bhagavan and the method of inquiry. Who am I? In 1965, I ordered the teaching of Ramana Maharshi in his own words by Osman and studied it in order to follow his teaching. But I found that much as I desired to understand the message, I still preferred the infinite way method. I continued to meditate regularly and listen to the inner voice by using the mantra as taught by the master of the infinite way by reciting, I and my Father are one. The ground where I stand is holy ground. All that the Father has is mine. During this time, I found an improvement in my attitude towards life. This pleased me, but I failed to hear the small voice until 4 years later, when during my waking and deep sleep, I felt a strange vibrating sensation all over my body and heard a clear voice telling me, not by might, not by power, but by my grace. This condition was very strange and elating. When I got up, I felt that a big load had been removed from me, and for a few days I was in a very happy and contented mood. I would have loved to have more such experiences, but unfortunately, in spite of my regular meditations, by infinite way method, there was no recurrence. Some years ago, Swami Chinmayananda from India visited my town, Lagos, Nigeria, and gave a 2-week course on the Bhagavad Gita, chapters 12 and 13, which my wife and myself attended and enjoyed. At the close of the course, he taught us another method of meditation, which I took up and started to use instead of the former infinite way method. Last year, I went on holiday and study leave to the United Kingdom, which lasted about 2 months. And during this time, in spite of my daily job, I experienced restlessness and discontent. In fact, I could hardly sleep at night. Unfortunately, before I returned home from my leave, I had a relapse of an ailment, which had healed 10 years ago. Altogether, I was beginning to be dissatisfied and disillusioned about my spiritual progress and decided to turn to some other teaching. One day, suddenly, I had the urge to read again Arthur Osborne's The Teaching of Maharshi in his own words, and I went through it carefully. Then I discovered, to my surprise, that this is the teaching I have been searching for all along. I read the book from cover to cover within a week, took notes, and started to practice the method of self-inquiry in meditation. After a few months, to be precise, about 4 months ago, I dreamt and saw Bhagavan. I sat in front of him, and he asked me whether I am ready to follow his teaching now, which I confirmed. The dream was brief, but when I woke up, I felt very happy that at last I have been initiated and accepted by Bhagavan. My wife, who for the past few years had been a student of the infinite way, has also suddenly become attracted to Bhagavan's teaching. My experience, as stated above, has clearly shown to me that the Maharshi guides his devotees slowly until their soul is ripe enough to embrace his teaching, which is the highest, wholeheartedly. May the grace of Sri Bhagavan continue to guide us. How I came to Maharishi. 15. Madeline Mende. Madeline Mende passed away on April 7, 1970, at the age of 67. In going through her personal papers, a friend of hers, Barbara Slough, came across an unfinished book in which there is a description of how I came to the Maharishi. An echo within ever whispers the soul's song. God, Guru, ancient one of olden time. My own self, whither, whence? How will it happen? Can it possibly happen to me? Cosmic calendar and clock decree a certain time, a certain place, when time is ripe, when time is right. Then came a marked turn in my spiritual road, truly turning point in life itself. Karmic predestinations, casually, informally, yet preordained. I occasionally met a friend in busy downtown Detroit. I mentioned Lanyon books. She swiftly stated, "Listen, you really should read Maharishi's books. The Maharishi is Lanyon's teacher. I'm leaving town soon, but you may use my two Maharishi books briefly for 3 days." Only 3 days? Of course. I tried to copy parts from those previous books, sensing their special, rare, true value. 2 years passed. At last, a few Maharishi books were available in New York. Heart and soul shared. The books were ordered. However, I wasn't home when the postman tried to deliver them. Our local post office closes at 5 o'clock. I arrived home at 6, noting that the books were available for me in the post office at 8 o'clock the next morning. I stood still in eager anticipation. This minute, right here, I'm 14 hours away from a Maharishi book. My own books. Spiritual feast to be savored slowly. Much of the reading was done with a sense of light in joyous silence. Then came the day of my life. In mid-morning, in midsummer. On this sunshiny morning, August 1961, I sat in a lawn chair in a secluded grassy inner courtyard. Mind was still, bliss of being amid stares of ecstasy. My own very dear Guru Maharshi, my very dear own Guru Maharshi. 6 accurate, sacred, sweet words stated 2 times from the heart. In the words of another, my fate and all that I was passed from that moment into the sacred hands of Sri Bhagwan forever. I had to come home. In my own case, the precious sense of Bhagwan presence has been with me ever since. Grace is. I would just like you to know, concludes Barbara Slough, that it was through Madeline that Bhagwan reached out to me and to many others here in Detroit. Not rich in earthly possessions, she gave all of herself. To whomever she spoke, it was always of being, looking within, and knowing oneself. I was with her as her time on earth drew to a close. 1 month before her passing, she told me of a vision she had of what would happen at the moment of giving up her body. When she did finally pass on 1 month later, it was in complete peace and very quickly. Fully conscious towards the end, she said, "With Bhagwan's grace, let me go in peace." How I came to Maharishi. 16. M. L. Bhatt. I am an individual from the common lot with not much of religious or spiritual background by way of environment or education. Brahmin by birth, brought up to an unrigid, flexible way of life. I developed a broad, even indifferent way of looking at things religious. When I was staying at Matunga, Bombay, in the building known as Teju Kaya Park, the Golden Jubilee celebrations of Sri Ramana Maharshi in 1947 were being celebrated with great eclat. Few of us went there and we humorously named the celebrated one Madrasi God Ramana. I cannot describe how and why, but the word Ramana got planted in me somewhere there, and then, and grew within me. 4 years passed by. I visited a relations office in November 1952 at Ahmedabad. He had put on exhibition many books of a famous Indian ashram and invited me to have a look and purchase some books which were brought to his office by an inmate of the ashram. Books were lying on the long table. I went through the line of them and at the end of it saw 6 books published by Sri Ramanashramam, Tiruvannamalai. I forgot about the other books I had intended to get and instead picked out all the 6 and went with them to my brother's house. I was fully engrossed, you could say buried, in the currents flowing without knowing or understanding what electric charge was developing within me. On my return to Delhi, I requested a learned friend to help me understand the spirituality I was being pushed into by my new books. He invited me to his residence. At 4 p.m., I started to read and he to guide me or cross-examine my understanding. We were going through the Gujarati book Ramana Vani, Maharshi's Gospel, in English, and Swami Madhvritirtha's Ramana Maharshi. I must have lost all outward consciousness as, when I finished the reading, I asked the time, saying my wife must be waiting for dinner. My friend, Sri Mohan Bhai Shah, who must have been watching me with the utmost patience for the last few hours, told me very kindly that it was 11 p.m. He added, "You have had your meal already at 9 p.m. with me, and look, my wife and children are already asleep." They were fast asleep on beds made upon the floor. I was fully unaware when I took my meal or when the beds were made up. My friend added, "Ramana Maharshi has possessed you." My eyes became wet and I went home. Since that day, I have never for a day forgotten Ramana, the god. I have had living experience of him. I am narrating these episodes after God Ramana has left his body at Tiruvannamalai. I had not the privilege to see him in his physical body. Since then, I have visited the ashram twice. It became my habit when traveling to recite Ram, Ram, Ramana, Ramana, with the running of the moving train. I felt the vibrations in my veins. Sometimes I felt his presence, and one day, to be exact at 7 p.m., on 18th December 1952, while traveling by train from Modinagar to Delhi, a poem came to me. Let me remember you, God Ramana, 100 times in a day. You came as a flash, once in my life, and Om Ramana, current flowing ceaselessly, by your grace, Lord Ramana. I close my eyes and you come, and keep the current flowing. I pray now, come, in recesses of my sleep, and give me your benevolent flash. My narration will be incomplete if I do not give the vivid experiences I have had of His presence felt, and my prayers miraculously answered. I was serving a big textile group and suddenly resigned on a question of prestige in July 1955. Mental depression followed. Who will give you employment, you fool? Now at the age of 47? I prayed and got the answer. Why worry? Be still. I cannot say why, but I decided that I would not make any frantic efforts or seek influence, but wait for the call from unknown quarters. I pledged myself to stay at home for 30 days and seek help only from prayer to the Master. I do not do any puja or ritual of any sort. My puja is only mental remembrance of him, by rhythm of which life may come and go at his will. 29 days passed, my courage diminishing day by day, but not my faith. Exactly on the 30th day, a casual acquaintance came to my house, seeking me and bringing an offer of a better job. I thanked the master. I had another vivid experience in 1964. By now, I had become a confirmed prarabdhavadi, or believer in destiny, according to my friends. Once again, when I resigned at the age of 55 in similar circumstances, another position came of its own accord. My colleague, Sri Gulab Chand Jain, exclaimed, "It is a miracle. Ramana Maharshi is protecting you." There have been more such happenings in my life. Some are very personal, and it is not my intention to narrate my own life. In conclusion, most humbly, I say that my prayers to the Master have been amply rewarded, that I have been a chosen one for such blessing. I am all submission to him, trying to propagate his teachings in my humble way. Let me remember you, God Ramana, 100 times a day. Let me. How I came to Maharishi. 17. Jean Claus. People may say, "You cannot have known Bhagwan. He lived in India and you in France." That is true. And yet, I have known Bhagwan and he has protected me. Bhagwan is the self. And for the self, time and space do not exist. It all began one afternoon in 1942 when Kamil Rao, one of his fervent devotees, came to see us in Nice. Because of the war, Camille, a French lady married to a Hindu, was unable to return to India after a visit to her family in France. Italian and German troops were everywhere in the country, bringing anguish and famine in their wake. And there, for the first time, I heard of the existence of the saint of Arunachala. Camille made me positively see the ashram, the coconut palms, the fairy mountain. With her I entered the large hall, where he is seated on a couch, giving darshan to the visitors. Incense sticks are lit, a light burns near him. I feel his presence. His so intensely kind and loving look, his gracious smile. Kamil Rao is no more than a voice in the dark. And then the voice also is silent, and Bhagwan is there, more real than in his material form. All troubles seem to dissolve. The very consciousness of I is absorbed by this powerful presence, and a wonderful feeling of bliss overwhelms us. Now, you know Ramana Maharshi. He will help you as he helps me, were Kamil Rao's parting words. Did she know how true the prophecy would be? Some time later, I was compelled by the military authorities of occupation to work in the office as interpreter, since I know German. This enabled me to save some lives. Later, the communists who ruled the town after the departure of the Germans arrested me. But as the prison was already full up, I was put in an old, disused ammunition storeroom together with 30 other men. There was no window, no light, no latrine, and only the cold concrete floor to sleep on. Out of the dark came a friendly voice. "My poor friend, if they have brought you here, you must be prepared for a prolonged stay, 8 or 10 weeks at least." I seemed to recognize the voice. "Excuse me, are you not?" Yes, I was the chief of cabinet of the last prefect, and we often saw each other at the Franco-German Labor Commission. By the way, you are in good company here. a colonel, 2 doctors, a notary, a chief accountant, all good French citizens. Only the place lacks a little comfort. Well, after 2 days of this nightmare, my wife contrived to see me for a few minutes. She brought me a blanket, a candle, matches, and a photo of Ramana Maharshi. A look at his eyes, his face, transformed everything. I was out of space, out of time with him who had transcended the world. Darkness, the fetid atmosphere, the prison walls lost their reality. When everybody was asleep, silence spoke to me of joy and freedom. And joy was in my heart. Jean-Claude, Jean-Claude, my neighbor shakes me. You're being called outside, hurry up. The door opens. A ray of sun enters the den. The guard makes impatient gestures. I am pushed out. Half blinded by the sudden light, I reel as if drunk. Come along, shouts the guard. A thought goes through my mind. Is it for the execution wall? But generally, this kind of walk takes place at dawn. Where are you taking me? We execute orders. What orders? Superior orders. And so miraculously I found myself without any apparent reason in a comfortable hospital bed with white linen, pure air, a smiling nurse. Really, it was paradise. I had accepted the ordeal through the Maharshi. I had gone further. It had become useless. And so it came to an end. Later on, in the course of the 5 months I spent in custody at the hospital in the wing reserved for sick and privileged political prisoners, I had several other proofs of the effective protection of Bhagwan. Once, for instance, there was panic among the prisoners because the floor just below was in flames. We were locked up and the wardens had gone to help. Each one of us saw himself already burnt alive. I felt inwardly absolutely quiet, taking refuge at the feet of Bhagwan, and instead of death, the firemen arrived. At another time, we all expected to be shot by the communist soldiers who had sent an ultimatum to the prefect. Nobody slept that night, and in all the eyes there was abject fear. So strong is the love of this little ego, so thick, the veil of Maya. But Ramana Maharshi made me see beyond, and all was well. How I came to Maharshi. 18. HWL Punja. I have been a visionary from childhood. When I was only 5 years old, I already had visions of Sri Krishna. At first I thought everyone could see them. I once said to my mother, "Look, he's standing there." But she explained to me that only I saw him. When I grew up, I joined the army. However, my desire for God experience grew so strong that after some years I resigned and decided to devote my life to sadhana. I wanted to become a sannyasi, but could not because I had a wife and children to look after. I started visiting swamis and asked each one point blank, "Have you seen God? And can you show me God?" I would allow no hedging. If they began to talk about it, I said, "Please give me straight yes or no." I found no one who could answer yes and returned to my home in the Punjab feeling very depressed. One day my wife was just serving my midday meal when a sadhu came and stood in the doorway. I invited him in and told her to serve him food too, and then asked him whether he could direct me to a swami who could show me God. He told me that I could find what I was looking for from Ramana Maharshi of Tiruvannamalai. It was the first time that I had heard of the Maharshi or of Tiruvannamalai So I wrote down both names. But how was I to get there? It was right down in the south, and my funds were almost exhausted. However, the next day I saw an advertisement in the paper for an ex-army man to run a canteen in Madras. I applied and was at once given the post and my fare paid. When I got to Madras, I said that I must first pay a visit to Thiruvannamalai before taking up my duties. Arriving there, I dumped my bedding in the ashram dormitory and went into the meditation hall. And who should I see there on the couch but the sadhu who had visited me at my home in the Punjab? I decided that he was a fraud. He had been travelling about India boasting himself and had then taken a train back and arrived before me. So I got up and left the hall. I got my bedding and was just putting it back on the horse cart that had brought me from the station when a devotee asked me why I was leaving so soon. I told him and he said, "It must be a mistake, because the Maharishi has never left this place since he first came nearly 50 years ago. Either it was someone else you saw, or he appeared to you by supernatural power." So I was back to the hall. As soon as I had an opportunity to see Bhagwan alone, I asked him my usual question. I added, "It's a bargain. I'm willing to pay any price, even my life, but your part of the bargain is to enable me to see God." At first he sat silent, but I said, "That's no good. I don't understand silence. Please give me a straight answer." Then he said, "I can enable you rather to be God than to see God." That puzzled me. I had very little understanding then. A few days later, I went for a walk in the rough country at the foot of the north slope of Arunachala and fell into a state of ecstasy, during which I again had a vision of Sri Krishna. When I got back, I told Bhagwan. He asked me, "Can you see Krishna now?" I said, "No, only when I have a vision." So he said, "What is the use of a God who comes and goes? If he is a real God, he should be with you always." That shocked me. Again, I almost lost faith in him, but some of the devotees explained to me. Before I left for Madras, I asked Bhagwan for a mantra, but he did not give me one. I asked him for permission to take sannyas, but he refused. However, shortly after my return to Madras, he appeared to me in a dream and gave me a mantra. Soon after this, I had a vision of God in human form. This was followed by a great change in me. I lost interest in all the ritual and incantations and breathing exercises that I had been doing up to then. For instance, I used to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning to attend to my statue of Sri Krishna. All such things ceased to interest me. I was very worried about this. I thought it meant I had become an atheist. At the first opportunity, I went to Thiruvannamalai. I told Bhagwan about the change that had come over me and how I had lost interest in all the ritual that I had been practicing regularly for so many years past. Bhagwan looked steadily at me for some time and then said something to me in Tamil, which, I was told, on inquiry, meant, "You, that is me, that is Bhagwan." These words sank into my heart, and I experienced the most wonderful feeling of bliss I had ever known. It was from this time that I began to understand Bhagwan and his teaching. How I came to Maharishi. 19. Apa B. Pant. I met Sri Bhagwan Ramana Maharshi in 1937 through Sri Maurice Friedman. We spent a couple of nights at Sri Ramanashramam in Thiruvannamalai. I well remember the day we reached there. There was some kind of festival and the hall where Bhagwan used to give his darshan was overflowing. We just could not even get in. We found a seat in a corner and fell silent. In a minute or two, I felt that there was radiance alight that was filling the whole hall. It was so quiet, so still, and yet there was plenty of movement and whispering and mumbling all around. It was as if the conflicts in the mind and its operations were being seen in a totally different perspective. The impression was so indelible. In the evening, we had prasad with Sri Bhagwan. We all sat on the ground and ate the same food. Bhagwan was completely still and quiet. No conversation whatsoever. I had just returned from England, and this was a bit strange for me as I was anxious to engage in some kind of argument and conversation. I had done a course in philosophy and thought I knew many of the answers to the eternal questions. I wanted to put these before Bhagwan, but somehow in his presence, I did not feel like opening my mouth. At night, it was hot. We slept in the open. I was sure I could not sleep at all. There was so much of turmoil and noise all around us in the ashram. People were arguing, even shouting at each other. There was running and banging of doors. The whole night it was impossible to sleep. I did not know that in an ashram like this, people would be allowed to speak so loud at night. In the morning, I spoke to Sri Maurice Friedman about this noise. He said, "What noise? There was no noise whatsoever. Everything was very peaceful. There was nobody who was speaking or arguing. In any case," he said, "this is not allowed after 9 o'clock as everybody goes to sleep or meditates." I was stunned. I was sure I had not slept a wink, and here was Morris saying that nobody had opened his mouth. Then it dawned on me. Bhagwan had given me a message. He had spoken without speaking that the mind creates and is chattering and arguing illusions, and that unless one goes beyond this turmoil, there can be no living in truth or liberation, mukti. He had given me in a flash the message that awareness is all. Next day, we were again sitting in the hall and Morris was asking him some questions. Bhagwan was sitting, quiet, nodding his head as he did sometimes, as if reflecting an inner vibration, so completely full of joy and radiance, but did not answer Morris's questions. Then, at one stage, he said, laughing, "Everyone here, each one of them, is a Buddha, but they just do not know it. If they would only know that they are Buddhas, always, there will be no problem." Of course, all this happened nearly 30 years ago, and it is only now, after a long period of experimentation and experience, that one reaches this understanding. The same evening, as I was going to sit down for the evening meal, Morris said to Bhagwan that I did an exercise of my father's called the Surya Namaskar. Bhagwan looked at me very straight and said, "Let me see how you do it." So there, in front of all the people just before dinner, I did 12 Surya Namaskars with breathing and mantras as my father had taught me. Bhagavan smilingly said, "Yes, it is a good exercise to be done after you have been sitting for hours in meditation, and your knees and other joints feel a little stiff." I never used to do any meditation at that time, but I know now that it was these words which kept me on the Surya Namaskars and led me to daily meditation. How can one speak of Bhagavan when what one has to do is to experience silence? Awareness is all. How I came to Maharshi. 20. D.S. Sastry. I had my first darshan of Bhagavan in May 1941. I happened to be in Madras at the time on my way from Cochin to Ahmedabad on transfer and was awaiting the arrival of my personal effects by train. As I was mentally worried over that transfer and was brooding over it, it occurred to me that I should go over to Tiruvannamalai to see the great Maharshi and obtain some solace from him. Some years before that, a friend of mine had asked me to accompany him to the ashram, but somehow I did not feel attracted. Earlier in my life, my experience of so-called holy men had been unfortunate, so I developed a prejudice. Subsequently, I visited several temples in South India but could not find any solace. But when I suggested to my wife that we should visit the ashram, she readily agreed and we started for Tiruvannamalai one fine morning. By the time we reached the ashram, it was past 11:30 a.m. All was quiet. The ashramites had had lunch and were resting. An attendant at the guest house took us into the kitchen and we had our lunch there. We were told that we could have Bhagwan's darshan only at 2:30. Having nothing particular to do, I strayed into the bookstall, told the attendant of the purpose of our visit, and sat there, reading one of the books for sale. At the time, there was no room behind the bookstall. Instead, there was a window opposite the main door. A little before 2:30, while returning from the bathroom at the eastern end of the ashram, Bhagwan stopped at the window to talk to someone who happened to be there. The bookstall attendant pointed him out to me. A thrill went through my whole body. What a difference from the swamis and the holy men I had seen before! That lustrous body, those shining eyes, that beauteous smile, that gentle speech and halting gait, all took me completely by surprise. I got up and slowly went into the hall. Bhagwan was there, seated on the couch, looking tenderly at all the devotees there. On entering the hall, the ego in me did not permit my prostrating before him. Instead, I just folded my hands by way of namaskar and sat down, watching critically all that was happening. People were coming and going, and not a word was spoken. Everybody appeared happy and contented. The prevailing serene atmosphere was infectious. I sat motionless. I had nothing to ask. I was lost in wonder and admiration at the peace and silence. The thought uppermost in my mind was, if people could be happy, thus with a minimum of food and clothing, why not I? Why these worldly possessions and the struggles incidental thereto? Why grieve about official worries and domestic calamities? At 4:45, Bhagwan left the hall as usual and came back later for Vedaparayana, which was arranged in the open space adjacent to the hall. The chanting of the Vedic hymns began in those idyllic surroundings, with the Ranachala on one side and the flower garden on the other, and with Bhagwan, wearing only a loincloth, sitting in the midst of the devotees. I felt as if I was in another world altogether. It was only when the chanting was over and devotees began leaving that I realized I was in this mundane world. Raja, the postmaster, told me that ladies were not allowed to stay overnight in the ashram and that I should seek an abode elsewhere. At my request, he fixed up for the night a house under construction in the compound of Mahasthan. After an early evening meal, my wife went to the house for a rest, while I stayed out in the ashram for supper at 7:30 with Bhagwan in the dining hall. After supper, I was reluctant to leave the ashram as I wanted to have more of Bhagwan. On inquiry, someone told me that Bhagwan might sit out for a while at that night, as it was very sultry. I therefore stayed on. Bhagwan came back after a short walk and sat on an easy chair in the open space between the hall and the well. A few devotees sat around him. One of them asked Bhagwan about an incident in Yoga Vashisht. Instead of just explaining it, Bhagwan began narrating the whole story at length. The pleasant way he spoke, the simple language he used, and the dignified manner in which he related the story captivated our hearts and kept us all spellbound. At the end of it, the devotees told me that I was particularly lucky because Bhagwan rarely spoke much or for such a long time. I felt extremely happy and gratified. That night, my wife and I compared notes. We were fully agreed that we had reached our haven and found our real guru. The mental satisfaction we could not get by our visits to temples or to other holy men, we had got in abundance in the ashram. We therefore stayed on for some more days. Thus began our attachment to Bhagavan and the ashram.